The paper hit the table between them like a gunshot, and Maggie Monroe did not flinch. Cornelius Ashford stood on the other side of her kitchen table with his expensive coat and his silver watch chain and his practiced smile, and he laid out the deed like a man who had never once been told no. 2,000 acres. A house with 4 rooms, a proper veranda and glass windows ordered from back east. A well already dug, a barn already standing, and enough cattle to fill both. He pushed the paper across the scarred wood toward her hands, as if the gesture itself were enough to close the deal. "Sign it," he said, and his voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who owned half the county and intended to own the other half before spring. "Sign it, and everything you see from here to the Red Ridge is yours, ours." Maggie looked at the deed. She looked at the pen he had placed beside it with deliberate care, as if arranging a trap with beautiful bait. Then she looked up at Cornelius Ashford, and her dark eyes were steady and clear and utterly unafraid. "You forgot something," she said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "I cannot imagine what. You forgot that I already made my choice." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the boards of the small homestead, and somewhere in the distance, one of her horses called out, and the sound of it was wild and free and nothing at all like what Cornelius Ashford was offering her. He leaned forward, and for the first time something dark moved behind his eyes. Something she had suspected was there all along. "Maggie, be reasonable. What does Hugh Blackwell have to offer you?" 160 acres under the Homestead Act, half of it hardpan, a house with a leaking roof, and a name that doesn't carry weight in a single town between here and Abilene. He's got nothing. I'm offering you everything. Maggie Monroe stood up from the table, and she was not tall, but she filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with height. She reached across the table and picked up the deed he had laid there, and she folded it with neat, deliberate precision, and she held it out to him. "Take it back," she said. "Take it all back, and do not come here again." His face changed. The smooth mask cracked, and what came underneath it was ugly, and Maggie had known it was there. She had known it from the first moment she saw the way he looked at her land, and then at her, and the order in which those glances fell had told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man Cornelius Ashford truly was. She had not always known Hugh Blackwell. There was a time, not so very long ago in calendar years, but an entire lifetime in the reckoning of hard experience, when Maggie Monroe had arrived in the New Mexico territory alone, with $63, a rolled surveyor's map, a rifle she could shoot better than most men alive, and a plan. The year was 1878, and the land around the town of Cimarron was still being carved up by ambition, by law, by violence, and by the slow and complicated machinery of Reconstruction and westward expansion. The Maxwell land grant had already torn the region apart once, and the cattle wars were a constant low drumbeat beneath everything, like a fever the land could not shake. It was not a gentle place. It was not a place that smiled on a woman alone. Maggie Monroe did not need it to smile on her. She had grown up in Missouri on a farm that her father had mapped and measured and surveyed with his own instruments, and from the time she was 8 years old, she had sat beside him at the drafting table and learned to read the language of contour lines and elevation markers and property corners as naturally as other children learned to read letters on a page. By the time she was 15, she was better at it than he was, and he had the honesty and the love for his daughter to admit it. By 20, she had read every surveying manual she could acquire, had corresponded with the General Land Office in Washington, and had performed independent surveys on 3 neighboring properties whose owners had disputes about boundary lines that the county surveyor could not satisfactorily resolve. She was 24 when her father died, leaving her the farm, the instruments, and a small inheritance that was enough to start over somewhere with room to breathe. Her mother had passed when Maggie was 11. There were no siblings. There was no husband, because she had turned down the 2 men who had asked, both of whom she had liked well enough, but neither of whom had looked at her the way she needed to be looked at. She needed a man who would see her fully, and both of those men had looked past the sharp intelligence in her eyes to find the softer outline of what they thought a wife should be. And she had told them both, as kindly as she could, that they deserved a woman who wanted what they were offering, and she was not that woman. She sold the Missouri farm for what it was worth, packed her father's transit and his chain and his field notes into a weathered case, and she came west. Cimarron, New Mexico, in the spring of 1878, was a town of dust and contradiction. The Santa Fe Trail still brought traffic through its main street, and the Ute and Apache peoples whose lands these had been were being pressed and pressed by the relentless machinery of American expansion. And the injustice of that pressing was written in the faces of the men and women Maggie saw being shuffled toward reservation boundaries that shrank every year. She saw it clearly, and it troubled her deeply, in the way that only things you cannot immediately fix can trouble a person with a conscience. She carried that trouble with her. She filed her own claim under the Homestead Act, 160 acres at the eastern edge of the valley, where a creek ran reliable through even the driest months, and she set her stakes and drew her boundaries with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. It was the staking that caused the first trouble. She had been on her claim 4 days, camping in a canvas tent while she assessed the land and began planning where the house would go, when 2 men rode up on horses that were too well kept for ordinary cowboys and wore expressions that told her they worked for someone important. They told her she had set her markers wrong. They told her this land was part of a larger holding. They told her, with the careful vagueness of men who have been coached in how to threaten without technically threatening, that she would be more comfortable elsewhere. Maggie looked at them. She set down the notebook she was writing in, and she picked up the surveying transit that stood on its tripod behind her. And she said, very calmly, "I have surveyed this property according to the government township and range system, and my markers are exactly where they should be according to both the recorded section corners and my own independent measurements. If your employer disputes the boundary, he is welcome to produce a survey conducted with equal precision. Until then, you are standing on my land, and I would appreciate it if you left it." They left, but she knew they would be back or someone else would come in their place. The someone else turned out to be Cornelius Ashford himself, that first time, riding up on a black horse and dressed in his expensive coat and introducing himself with a smile that showed all his teeth. He had heard, he said, that a woman had filed on the creek land. He had come to make a neighborly offer. He explained that he controlled a substantial portion of the surrounding acreage and that the creek land was, strategically speaking, important to the overall water access of the region. He was prepared to be very generous in his purchase price. Maggie told him the land was not for sale. He smiled more. He said he understood she had only just arrived, that establishing a homestead alone was an enormous undertaking, that perhaps she had not fully considered the challenges ahead of her. Maggie said she had considered them quite thoroughly. He left that day with the same kind of careful pleasantness he had arrived with, but she had seen the thing behind his eyes even then. The calculation. The patience of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through accumulated pressure if the direct approach failed. She had 3 months of relative quiet after that. She built her house herself, with the help of 2 brothers named Abelard and Pete Vega, who were homesteaders on the next section east, and who traded their labor for her help surveying the exact boundaries of their own claim, which a previous amateur effort had left genuinely confused. She learned to trust the Vega brothers, and they learned to trust her, and that mutual trust became one of the things that kept her alive in what was coming. Her house was small. 2 rooms, solid walls, a fireplace that drew well because she had thought carefully about the placement of the chimney, a proper root cellar, a lean-to for her horse. She was proud of it in a way that went deep, the way a person is proud of something they built with their own hands from raw necessity and good thinking. It was in September that she first met Hugh Blackwell. She was running a survey line along the northern edge of her property, moving through dry grass and occasional juniper with her chain and her notebook, when she heard the sound of a horse coming fast, and then the horse pulling up hard, and a man's voice saying something low and urgent that she could not quite hear. She straightened from where she had been crouching to mark a stake, and she saw him. He was on a gray horse, and he had pulled up at the edge of a small arroyo perhaps 30 yards from where she stood. He was big, broad in the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas coat and a hat that had seen better years. He was looking down into the arroyo with the focused attention of a man who had found something significant, and then he looked up and saw her, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the dry autumn grass. "Morning," he said, and his voice carried without effort across the distance between them. "Good morning," she said. He looked at the tripod on its legs and the chain coiled at her feet and the notebook in her hand, and something in his expression shifted from a kind of careful wariness to curiosity. "Are you the woman who filed on the creek land?" "I am," she said. "Maggie Monroe." "Hugh Blackwell," he said. "I'm on the section north of yours." He nodded toward the arroyo. "You got a problem with your fence line over here." She walked toward him and looked where he indicated, and she saw that someone had pulled 2 of her posts out of the ground and moved them 6 feet south, which would have shifted the apparent boundary of her property and given approximately 3 acres of her land the appearance of being unclaimed territory. Her jaw tightened. "I see that. Ashford's men, I expect," Hugh said. He said it flatly, without particular heat, as if reporting a weather condition. "You know about him," she said. "No, he's been buying up or pressuring out every claim in this valley for the past 2 years, Hugh said. "No, he's got his eye on the water rights especially. Your creek makes you particularly interesting to him." Maggie looked at the moved posts, then back at the man on the gray horse. He had an honest face, she thought. Not a simple face, but an honest one. The lines of it had been put there by weather and work and something else that she would take time to understand, but there was nothing hidden in the way he looked at her. He was looking at her directly, without the sideways quality she had seen in men who were measuring her for what she was worth to them. "Will you help me reset these?" she asked. He was off his horse before she finished the sentence. They worked together for an hour that morning, resetting the posts and running a new check measurement that Maggie performed with the transit, while Hugh held the rod at each point she needed. She gave him the instructions clearly and precisely, and he followed them without argument or the particular kind of male reluctance to take direction from a woman that she had encountered before and braced herself for. He simply did what she asked, efficiently and without wasted motion, and when she had confirmed all 4 corners were correct, she made a careful notation in her field book with the date and the measurements and a description of the vandalism she had found. "Evidence," she said, showing him the notation. "If this comes to a legal dispute, documented field measurements taken on a specific date and verified with a calibrated instrument carry weight." He looked at the careful columns of numbers in her notebook, and he did not say what some men would have said, which was to express surprise that she knew what she was doing. He just nodded. "Smart," he said, as if it were simply a fact, which it was. They rode back toward her homestead together, and she made coffee on the outdoor fire because the September weather was still warm and she liked sitting outside in the morning. And he accepted a cup and sat on the upturned crate. She offered and told her a little about the valley and about Cornelius Ashford in particular. Hugh Blackwell had come to the territory 3 years before, he said, from Texas, where he had worked cattle for other men until he had saved enough to file his own claim and start his own small herd. He had 60 head of cattle now, and a house he had built in his first winter that was not beautiful but was solid. He knew the land around here well. He knew which water holes ran reliable and which dried up in August, and he knew which of the other settlers in the valley were trustworthy, and which were watching to see which way the wind blew before they committed to any position. He said all of this plainly, without self-promotion, in the way of a man who is simply providing information that might be useful to someone he has decided to help. And it was that quality, she would think later, that was the beginning of everything. The plainness of him. The absence of theater. Ashford has been making offers to everyone in the valley, she asked. To everyone he thinks he can get to, Hugh said. Some people have taken the offers because they needed the money or they were tired of the fight. Some people have stayed. The Vega brothers, they're staying. Old Rosalind Henley over on the south section, she's staying, though she's got to be 60 years old and she's running that place alone since her husband died. He paused. He made an offer to me last spring. And, he looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup. I told him no. She studied him. He will try again. I expect so, Hugh said. He always does. She found out in stages over the following weeks and months what Hugh Blackwell was made of, and the more she learned, the more she respected it. He was not a man who talked much about himself, but the valley talked about him, and the Vega brothers talked about him, and old Rosalind Henley talked about him with the particular warmth of a woman who had watched him chop her winter firewood without being asked and never mentioned it to anyone. He was 31 years old, she learned. Born in Arkansas, raised to hard work. He had come to Texas at 20 with nothing, and had built himself up through sheer stubbornness and a genuine talent with cattle that was about more than physical skill. It was about understanding them, reading them, knowing how they moved and why, the way some people understood horses or weather. He had come to New Mexico because Texas was getting crowded, and because he wanted his own land, and because there was something about the particular quality of space in the territory that called to him in a way he could not entirely explain but did not feel the need to. He had never been married. He had come close once, a woman in Texas named Clara who had decided, reasonably enough, that a cowboy working for wages on another man's ranch was not what she was looking for, and she had married a storekeeper instead, and Hugh bore her no ill will for it. He told Maggie this in a matter-of-fact way one afternoon in October when they had fallen into the easy habit of riding together on Sunday afternoons to check the fence lines they shared and drink coffee and talk about the valley and the state of things. He told her because she had asked directly, because she was not a woman who approached things sideways. "Do you wish she had stayed?" Maggie asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He did not give her the reflexive answer. "No," he said, after a moment. "I think we would have made each other miserable." She wanted a different kind of life than I could give her, and wanting someone to change what they are is a poor foundation for a marriage. "Do you still want to get married?" she asked, just as directly. He looked at her with those steady eyes that always seemed to be taking in more than they revealed, and a slow warmth moved through his expression. "I think," he said carefully, "that the right kind of marriage to the right kind of woman would be the best thing in the world. I just have not had the occasion to revise my opinion of what that looks like until fairly recently." The way he said it left no doubt about what he meant, and Maggie felt the warmth of it move through her chest, and she looked away at the mountains in the west where the light was doing something remarkable with the clouds, and she thought about what it meant that a man who used so few words could sometimes say exactly the thing that landed most precisely. She did not say anything in response, not that afternoon, but she did not discourage it either. November brought the first real trouble. Ashford's men had been moving cattle onto the southern edge of her property, using the range as if the boundaries she had established did not exist. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning when she went to check on the creek and found 50 head of cattle she did not own standing on her land, drinking her water, and cutting up the grass her own 2 horses needed. She rode to Hugh's place immediately. He saddled up without any questions and came with her, and they spent most of that day pushing the cattle back off her land and documenting exactly where they had been found, with Maggie making careful notations in her field book and Hugh keeping account of the cattle and the brand they carried, which was Ashford's AA brand burned into the left hip. "He is testing me," Maggie said. "He is," Hugh agreed. "He wants to see if I will file a complaint or just absorb it." "What are you going to do?" Hugh asked, and his tone was genuine inquiry, not challenge. She had come to understand, genuinely curious about what she would decide and genuinely prepared to support whatever she chose. He was not waiting to see if she needed rescuing. He was waiting to see what she needed. I am going to ride to Cimarron tomorrow and file a formal trespass complaint with the county, she said, with this field book as documentation, and I am going to send a copy of the documentation to the land office in Santa Fe. Hugh nodded. I'll come with you. You do not need to, she said. I know I do not need to, he said. I want to. They rode to Cimarron the following morning on the old Santa Fe Trail Road, and the county clerk, a thin man named Horace Birch who had the particular nervous quality of a man who worked in the proximity of Cornelius Ashford's influence, looked at Maggie's field book with wide eyes, and then looked at Hugh with an expression that clearly wanted to redirect the whole conversation to the man present. Hugh looked back at him without expression and said, "Miss Monroe is the one you need to talk to. She conducted the survey." Horace Birch filed the complaint. He did not look entirely comfortable doing it, but he did it, because the documentation Maggie presented was precise and professional and impossible to argue with without looking like a fool or something worse. On the way back, riding through the cold November afternoon with the smell of approaching snow on the wind, Hugh said, "He is not going to take that sitting down." "I know," Maggie said. "Good." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had been seeing more and more, a kind of wonder layered over the respect, as if she kept doing things he had not expected, and each one of them added another dimension to the thing he was feeling about her. She had begun to love that look in a private way she had not yet admitted even to herself. "You are not afraid of him," Hugh said. "I'm a little afraid of him," she said honestly. "He has more resources and more connections than I do, and he is willing to use them in ugly ways. I would be foolish not to feel some fear, but fear and retreat are not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "No, they are not," and she heard something personal in the way he said it, something from his own experience that he was not yet ready to say more about. The snow came that night, and it was the first real winter snow of the season, and it changed the quality of everything. Maggie woke to white silence and the soft sound of flakes against her window glass, which she had managed to acquire from a supply wagon in September and install herself. And she made coffee and stood at the window and thought about the spring planting and about Hugh Blackwell and about Cornelius Ashford and the county clerk's nervous hands on her field book. The dark past that Hugh was carrying revealed itself not all at once but in pieces, the way most things worth knowing reveal themselves. He had been present. She learned through a conversation with Pete Vega one cold afternoon when Hugh was not around, at one of the range wars in Texas 6 years earlier. He had been working for a small rancher who had been targeted by a larger operation that wanted his water access, and the conflict had turned violent, and 2 men had been killed, and Hugh had been one of the men holding a rifle when it happened. He had not pulled the trigger, Pete said, but he had been there, and the memory of it had settled into him like an old wound that healed over but never fully resolved. When she was alone with Hugh next, she looked at him carefully and she said, "Tell me about Texas." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at his coffee, and then he looked at the mountains, and she watched him make the decision to trust her with it. When he spoke, he was slow and precise, choosing his words the way she chose her measurements. He told her about the Danner outfit, and the men who had worked for it, and the night in April 1872, when the conflict that had been building for months had finally cracked open, and 2 men had died. He told her he had nightmares about it still, irregular but persistent, and that part of what had driven him to build his own place in his own name was a need to have something that was his, that he had made by honest means, that did not have any of that old violence wound through it. He told her that when he looked at his land, he wanted to feel clean. Maggie set down her coffee cup and she reached across the small space between them and she put her hand over his briefly, firmly, the way you grip something that matters. "You did not start that conflict," she said, "and you are not that moment." He looked at her hand on his, and then he looked at her face, and what moved across his expression was something so raw and unguarded that it made her chest ache. "No," he said. "I know that, but it helps to hear someone else say it." December brought a letter from the land office in Santa Fe. The trespass complaint had been registered. Cornelius Ashford had filed a counterclaim asserting that the boundary markers on the southern portion of Maggie's claim were inaccurate. He had hired a surveyor, the letter said, to conduct an independent survey. Maggie read this letter twice, folded it, and went out to her surveying case and opened it with the particular calm of someone who is stepping into a fight they are confident they can win. She spent 4 days in the cold December air resurveying every boundary of her property, running the numbers from multiple independent starting points, checking her angles with the kind of repetitive precision that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. She wrote everything in her field book in her clear, careful hand. She cross-referenced her measurements with the original government survey markers that had been placed when the township was laid out, verifying that her starting points were exactly where they should be. When she was finished, she had a survey document that was as close to irrefutable as a human being could make with the instruments of 1878, and she made 2 copies by hand, and she sent one to Santa Fe and kept one and showed the third to Hugh. He sat at her kitchen table that evening and went through her field notes with the careful attention of a man who was trying to understand something rather than simply approve of it, and she walked him through the mathematics and the geometry, and she watched him follow it, and she watched the moment when he understood the full picture of what she had done, how thoroughly she had documented her position, and how precisely she had prepared for this fight. He set the field book down on the table, and he looked at her, and what she saw in his face in that moment was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He was completely, genuinely shocked by the scope and precision of what she had done, and then the shock opened into something so deep and warm and unambiguous that it did not leave any room for misinterpretation. He was looking at her the way she had always needed to be looked at. He was seeing her, all of her, and what he was feeling about what he saw was admiration and tenderness, and the particular awe of a person encountering something that exceeds their already generous expectations. "Maggie," he said, and he stopped, and he tried again. "I have met a lot of people in my life who were good at things, cowboys who could read cattle the way most men read books, trackers who could follow a trail across hardpan. I have never in my life seen anything like this." She felt warmth rise in her face that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the quality of his attention. "It is just mathematics and careful observation," she said. "No," he said firmly. "It is not just anything. Do not do that," she blinked. "Do not diminish it," he said. "This is exceptional, and you should let it be exceptional." The silence between them after that was the kind that has weight and warmth, and a particular quality of being poised at the edge of something large. She felt it, and she was almost certain he felt it, and they sat with it for a moment in the lamplight of her kitchen with the winter wind pressing at the walls of the house she had built herself. "I should head home," he said finally. "Early morning." He stood up and he took his hat from the hook by the door, and he turned back to her with the hat in his hands, and he said very quietly, "I am proud of you, for what that is worth from me." "It is worth quite a lot," she said just as quietly. He left, and she sat alone in the warm kitchen for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded into the cold dark, and she allowed herself to acknowledge, fully and without reservation, that she was in love with Hugh Blackwell. The feeling had been building since September, and she had been watching it grow the way you watch a slow river rise, measuring it, understanding its dimensions, and now it had risen to the point where there was no longer any question about what it was. She was also, she reflected, not at all sure what to do about it. January was brutal, as New Mexico Januaries can be, with cold that came down from the mountains and a wind that had no mercy. Maggie kept her livestock fed and watered and managed the small emergencies of a homestead in winter with steady competence, and she and Hugh saw each other less often because the weather made travel difficult, but the Sundays when it was passable they still rode out to check their shared fence line, bundled in every coat they owned, talking through the steam of their breath in the cold air. It was on one of those January Sundays that Hugh said, "Ashford came to see me again." She looked at him. "When?" "Thursday. Rode up to my place with the same proposition he has been circling around for months. More land, better offer. He is starting to make it sound like a favor." Hugh's jaw was set in a way that told her the visit had left him angry. "He also said something about you." "What did he say?" Hugh was quiet for a moment, clearly deciding how to say it. "He said a woman alone out here was a liability, that it was not safe for you and not sustainable, and that the smart thing for everyone concerned would be for you to take his offer and for me to take mine, and then his operation could have the water access it needed and everyone would have what they wanted." "And what did you tell him?" she asked, though she was fairly confident she already knew. "I told him Miss Monroe did not require anyone's assessment of her situation," Hugh said, "and that he should direct his concerns to her directly if he had them, since she was perfectly capable of answering for herself. And then I asked him to leave my property." Maggie felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature, not because he had defended her exactly, but because of how he had done it. Not by claiming her, not by saying she was under his protection. By insisting on her right to speak for herself. "Thank you," she said. "I did not enjoy that conversation," he said. "He is a man who thinks everyone has a price. It irritates me." "Because you know your price is not what he thinks it is." He glanced at her. "Because some things do not have a price at all." She understood that he was not only talking about land. The counter-survey that Ashford had commissioned came back in February, and it was, as Maggie had suspected it might be, flawed in a way that was possibly accidental, but that had the convenient result of suggesting her southern boundary lay 30 feet farther north than she had marked it. 30 feet that happened to include the best stretch of the creek access. She identified the flaw in 45 minutes. The surveyor Ashford had hired had made an error in his initial setup, using a starting point that did not correctly reference the original government section corner. The error was small enough that a person without thorough knowledge of the township and range system might not catch it. But Maggie caught it, and she documented how she had caught it, and she wrote a detailed technical response that went to the land office in Santa Fe with her counter-documentation attached. She showed it to Hugh on a February evening when a Chinook had come through and the air was briefly, surprisingly warm, and they sat on the step of her house in the unexpected warmth, and he read it through with the same focused attention he gave everything she showed him. When he finished, he let out a long breath. "He is going to know you found it. He is going to know anyone with the proper training would have found it," Maggie said, "which should tell him something about the quality of his hired survey." "He is not going to like this." "No," she agreed, "he is not." Hugh turned to look at her, and the warmth of the day and the warmth in his expression were doing something complicated and lovely to the air between them. "Are you frightened?" he asked, not in a protective way, in a genuine, trying to understand way. "Some," she said. "He has more money and more political connections than I do, and I know what can happen when men with resources decide to make things difficult. But I have the truth on my side and the documentation to prove it, and if this comes to a legal proceeding, I am confident about the outcome." She paused. "I am more frightened of other things." "Like what?" he asked softly. She looked at him directly, because she was Maggie Monroe and she did not approach things sideways. "Like the possibility of wanting something that might not be available," she said. "That kind of uncertainty is harder for me to sit with than a land dispute." He held her gaze, and the thing that moved through his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. He reached out very slowly and he took her hand, and his hands were big and rough and warm, and he held hers with a careful gentleness that was the most deliberate thing she had ever felt. "It is available," he said, "if you want it." The February warmth held them for a moment that expanded to fill everything, and then she leaned against him very slightly, her shoulder against his arm, and they sat on the step of her house and looked out at the valley that was briefly, impossibly warm in the middle of winter, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more for a very long time. March brought mud and new grass and the first genuine warmth of approaching spring, and Maggie Monroe and Hugh Blackwell settled into something that was not yet spoken aloud in all its fullness, but that was entirely visible to everyone who knew them. The Vega brothers traded looks across a fire one evening when Hugh and Maggie rode up together, and Abelard Vega said something in Spanish to his brother that made Pete grin and look away, and nobody said anything about it directly. They spent more time at each other's places. Hugh repaired a section of her fence line that the winter had damaged and did not mention it until she found it and came to thank him. And she helped him with a calving difficulty one early March night, when she happened to be at his place, helping him review a water rights document. And the heifer in question decided to go into labor at midnight with complications that needed 2 sets of hands. She had pulled calves before on her father's Missouri farm, and she handled it efficiently, and the calf that resulted was a healthy bull calf that stood up on shaking legs in the lantern light, and Hugh looked at her across the straw-covered floor of the barn with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of speechless admiration. "You keep surprising me," he said. "You are easier to surprise than I expected," she said, and he laughed, and the sound of it in the warm lamplit barn was one of the best things she had ever heard. He had a good laugh. It did not come out often or easily, but when it came it was real and unreserved, and it changed his whole face, softening the weather-carved lines of it into something that showed the man he might have been in easier circumstances. She treasured every instance of it. The land office ruling came in April. A letter addressed to Miss Margaret Monroe arrived at the Cimarron post office, and she rode to collect it with Hugh beside her, and she opened it standing on the boardwalk in the spring sunshine with the letter in her hands, and she read it twice, and then she looked up. "The counter-survey has been rejected," she said. "My original survey stands. The boundary markers are confirmed as recorded." Hugh said nothing for a moment. Then he took off his hat and turned it in his hands, and he looked at her with an expression that held all the warmth she had ever wanted to see directed at her. "That is the right outcome," he said. "It is," she said. "I knew it would be." "I know you did," he said. "I was sure of it too, but I am glad the land office figured it out." She folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into her coat pocket, and she became aware that the people on the boardwalk around them were watching. That old Mrs. Hartley from the dry goods store was looking at them with undisguised curiosity, and she became aware that she did not care in the slightest. "Buy me a cup of coffee," she said. His mouth turned up at one corner. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he offered his arm with a formal quality that was also gently comic, and she took it, and they walked into the cafe on Cimarron's main street together in the April sunshine, and the watching people on the boardwalk could think whatever they liked about it. It was over coffee that he said, quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I want to say first that the answer does not change anything between us. If you say no, I will be disappointed, but I will still be here and I will still be your neighbor and your friend for as long as you want that." She looked at him across the table. Her heart was doing something that was not entirely comfortable and entirely welcome. "All right," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "Officially. I would like to ask your permission to come calling as a man who intends, if you will have him, to eventually make you a formal offer of marriage. I want to do it right." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the 2 men in Missouri who had asked her to marry them without truly seeing her, and she thought about the way Hugh Blackwell had looked at her field notes with genuine awe, and the way he had refused to speak for her to Ashford, insisting instead on her right to speak for herself, and the way he had held her hand on the step of her house in February with a gentleness that had nothing of possession in it. And she thought about the laugh in the barn and the steady eyes and the dark past he had trusted her with, and the way he said her name, which was just 2 syllables but in his voice carried the whole weight of what she had come to mean to him. "Yes," she said simply. "I give you that permission." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely sure, despite his diplomatic caveat, what she was going to say, and the relief and happiness that moved across his face were the most honest things she had seen in a long time. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed, and then she drank her coffee, and the April sun came through the cafe window and lay across the table between them, warm and promising. What neither of them anticipated was that Cornelius Ashford had not finished. He had been quiet since the land office ruling, and a quiet Ashford was more frightening in some ways than a loud one, because it meant he was thinking, recalculating, finding a different approach. Maggie had known this and had been watchful, and so it was not a surprise when his next move materialized in May. It was just more direct than she had anticipated. He arrived at her homestead on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of May, and he arrived alone, which was unusual for him, and he was dressed in his best coat, and he was carrying his hat instead of wearing it. And when she opened the door to him, she felt the first genuine unease she had felt about him since the early days, because this version of Cornelius Ashford was more unpredictable than the version that sent lawyers and surveyors and cattle onto her land. This version was coming to offer something personal. She let him in, because refusing him entry with no witnesses present was its own kind of risk, and she kept the table between them, and she did not offer coffee, and she waited. He laid out his proposal with the same careful preparation he brought to everything. He had, he said, reconsidered his approach. He had been clumsy, he acknowledged, and he regretted the difficulties that his agents had caused. He wanted to start fresh. He was, he said, interested in her as a woman, not merely as a property concern, and he believed that they could do something remarkable together. He presented his full offer: 2,000 acres, a 4-room house with glass windows from the east, a barn, a dug well, cattle, and complete financial security. In exchange, he was asking for her hand in marriage. He placed a paper on the table, a deed. "Everything on this paper is yours, free and clear upon our marriage," he said. "The land will be in your name. I am prepared to be generous." Maggie looked at the deed. She looked at the pen. She thought very clearly and briefly about Hugh Blackwell's 160 acres of hardpan, and his house with the sometimes leaking roof, and his 60 head of cattle, and his honest face, and his steady eyes, and the laugh in the barn, and February's warmth on a cold step. "I already made my choice," she said. Ashford's face changed. "You are choosing Blackwell." "I am choosing Blackwell," she said. "He has nothing to offer you compared to this," Ashford said, and his voice had lost its smooth quality, the mask beginning to slide. "He has a quarter section of mediocre land and a house that needs work and a small herd. You are an intelligent woman. You understand value. Why would you choose less when more is sitting right in front of you?" "Because what I see in front of me," Maggie said with great clarity, "is a man who has been trying to take my land by force, by fraud, and by intimidation since the day I arrived in this valley, who sent cattle onto my property, hired a surveyor to falsify a boundary, and has now arrived to offer me a reward for surrendering what he could not take by other means, and because the man I have chosen has never once tried to take anything from me. He has only ever added to what I have." Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him shifted, and what came through was the thing she had always known was under the surface. The anger of a man who is not accustomed to being refused. "You will regret this," he said. He kept his voice even, but the threat was in it as plainly as if he had shouted it. "Take the deed," she said, "and do not come here again." He picked up the deed. He picked up his pen. He put on his hat. He left. Maggie stood in her kitchen until she heard the sound of his horse leaving, and then she sat down at the table and she allowed her hands to shake for a moment, because she was not reckless about fear, and she recognized genuine danger, and Cornelius Ashford in that moment had felt genuinely dangerous. She let the shaking run through her hands and she breathed steadily, And then the shaking stopped and she got up and she went to saddle her horse. She rode to Hugh's place. He was in the corral working with one of his younger horses when she came into the yard, and he took one look at her face and came over the fence rail without stopping to open the gate. "What happened?" he said. She told him concisely and completely. She watched his face as she told it, and she watched the anger move through him, clean and focused, not explosive but very deep. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and his jaw was set and his hands were still, which she had come to understand was how his emotion expressed itself when he was holding it carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "He did not touch me. He was controlled." But there was a threat in what he said when he left. "I know," Hugh said. "I heard it." "What do you think he will do?" she asked. "I think he will try one more thing," Hugh said. "Something that goes outside the law because everything inside it has failed him. I think we need to be watchful, and I think we should tell the Vega brothers, and I think," he paused, "I think we should go to the county sheriff and make a formal record of this visit and his threat. Today." "Agreed," she said. They rode to Cimarron together that afternoon, and Hugh waited in the outer room while she gave the sheriff a formal statement, because she could give it herself, and that was the correct and natural order of things. The sheriff, a weathered man named Cal Brody, who had the practical intelligence of a person who had survived in a complicated job for a long time, listened carefully and asked good questions and wrote everything down, and said he would be paying a visit to Cornelius Ashford's property to have a direct conversation about the boundaries of acceptable behavior. On the ride back, the late May afternoon was golden and warm around them, and the mountains were blue and clear in the west, and Maggie felt the solidity of the ground under her horse and the solidity of the man riding beside her, and the combination of those two solidities was enough. "He said I would regret my choice," she said. "What do you think about that?" Hugh asked. She looked at the valley stretching around them, at the creek she could see glinting in the low sun, at the small house she had built, and the land she had surveyed and defended and kept. She looked at Hugh Blackwell riding beside her on his gray horse with his honest face and his worn hat and his 60 head of cattle and his 160 acres of occasionally mediocre land. "I think he does not understand the things I value," she said. Hugh looked at her, and there was that expression again, the one with the warmth and the wonder and the particular depth of a man who has found something he had not known he was looking for. "No," he said. "He does not understand them at all." Ashford's final move came 3 weeks later in June, and it was simultaneously more dramatic and more clumsy than anything he had done before, which in retrospect made a certain psychological sense. A man used to getting his way, losing repeatedly and visibly, tends eventually toward desperation, and desperation makes smart men do foolish things. What he did was hire 2 men to pull out every boundary marker on the west side of Maggie's property, and replace them with new markers placed 15 feet east of where hers had been. And then he moved cattle onto the section of land between the old line and the new one, and filed an emergency petition, with the county claiming that Maggie's original markers had been placed on land that was part of his prior grazing lease. He did this on a Thursday night, and Maggie found it Friday morning. She did not panic. She stood at the line of new, false markers, and she looked at them with cold, clear eyes, and then she went back to her house and she got her transit and her chain and her field book, and she went back out and she surveyed the entire western boundary from scratch, documenting every false marker with its exact location relative to the true boundary, measuring the displacement, noting the cattle, noting the new false claim stakes she found interleaved with the moved markers. She worked all day Friday. Hugh arrived mid-morning, having heard from Pete Vega that something was happening on her western boundary, and he came prepared to help, and she put him to work as her rod man, moving where she directed with the surveying rod so she could take her readings, and they worked together through the long June day without stopping for more than a brief rest in some water at noon. By late afternoon she had a complete documented record of the false markers, their positions, their displacement from the true boundary, and the mathematical proof, rooted in the original government section corners, that could not be reasonably challenged. She was dirty and tired, and her back ached from hours of crouching over the instrument, and she was absolutely furious, and Hugh could see all of this. And when she finally closed her field book and straightened up from the last reading, he came to stand beside her, and he said nothing, just stood close, and the warmth of him beside her in the evening air was steadying in a way that did not need words. "He has made a mistake," she said quietly. "He has," Hugh agreed. "He has done this in a way that can be proven conclusively to be fraudulent, and I have the documentation to prove it." "You do?" "And he has just committed land fraud, which is a federal offense, not a civil one." A beat of silence. Then Hugh said, "The land office." "And the United States Attorney's office," she said. "This is no longer a property dispute. This is criminal fraud." She filed the documentation with the county sheriff on Saturday morning. She sent copies by post to the Santa Fe Land Office and to the United States Attorney's office on Monday. She was thorough, organized, and completely calm about it, with the exception of the hands that wanted to shake for about 10 minutes on Saturday morning, which she allowed and then moved past. The investigation that followed took most of the summer, and it was not quiet or comfortable. Ashford hired lawyers from Santa Fe who were very expensive and very articulate, and they made arguments that were not entirely without cleverness. But at the center of the case was Maggie Monroe's documentation, and her documentation was, as the federal investigator sent from Santa Fe observed in a private comment to Sheriff Brody that Brody later repeated to Hugh, the most thorough and professionally executed survey record he had encountered in 11 years of land investigation work. In August, Cornelius Ashford accepted a negotiated resolution that required him to pay a significant fine, to restore all markers to their correct positions at his own expense, to permanently relinquish any claim to the land within or adjacent to Maggie Monroe's recorded property, and to sign a formal acknowledgement that the original survey as conducted and recorded by Margaret Monroe was correct and binding. He left the county in September. Not because he was required to, but because, Maggie suspected, a man of his particular type cannot sustain himself in a place where he has been visibly beaten and publicly embarrassed, and the county of Colfax had made it very clear which way it stood on Cornelius Ashford. On the day she received the final signed resolution document, Maggie sat at her kitchen table for a long time and felt something settle in her that had been held taut for over a year. The creek outside her window ran in the late August warmth, and her 2 horses moved in the small pasture she could see from where she sat, and the house she had built was solid around her, and she thought about her father at his drafting table and his instruments and his belief that the land could be read like a language if you learned to look at it right. Hugh arrived that evening because she had sent Pete Vega to tell him the resolution had come, and she heard his horse in the yard, and she went to the door, and he was coming up the step with his hat in his hand, and his face open in the way it was sometimes when he came to her, unguarded in a way she knew he was not with other people. "It is done," she said. "I know," he said. "Pete told me." She stepped back to let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she made coffee, and the late August light came golden through the window glass and lay across the table between them, and after a while he said, without looking up from his coffee, "I would like to formally ask you to marry me." She looked at him. He looked up. "I know what I am offering," he said. "I am not going to pretend it is more than it is. I have 160 acres, some of which is hardpan. I have a house that needed some roof work this spring, which I did, so it no longer leaks. I have 63 head of cattle now because that heifer had a good calf in March." He paused. "I have nothing that anyone would describe as a grand offer, I know that." "Hugh," she said. "I want to tell you what I do have," he said, because he needed to say it, and she waited. "I have respect for you that is not the ordinary kind. I have never once looked at you and seen anything less than everything you are, and I never will. I have a genuine desire for your happiness that is not about anything I get from it. I have loved you since February when you told me that fear and retreat are not the same thing, and then did not retreat from anything." He stopped and took a breath. "And I have a particular problem where I cannot imagine the rest of my life without you in it, and I would rather live with that problem honestly than pretend I can solve it any other way." The evening was very still. Something moved in the pasture outside. The coffee cooled between them. Maggie Monroe, who was practical and precise, and who did not approach things sideways, and who had not cried in front of another person since the day her father died, felt her eyes sting very slightly, which she acknowledged and did not try to prevent. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and the warmth of it went all the way through her. "Yes," she repeated, and she was smiling, and he was smiling, and the August light on the table between them was the color of everything she had been working toward since she had packed her father's instruments and come west looking for a place with room to breathe. They were married in October by the circuit minister, who came through Cimarron on a regular loop, in a ceremony attended by the Vega brothers and old Rosalind Henley and Sheriff Brody and Horace Birch, the county clerk, and a small collection of Valley families who had watched the whole complicated story of that year play out, and who had formed their opinions accordingly. Rosalind Henley, who was 62 years old and had seen considerable life, told Maggie before the ceremony that she had never once in all her years watched a woman handle a land dispute with that kind of skill and composure, and that she was very pleased to see the outcome. "Thank you," Maggie said. "He is a good man," Rosalind said, meaning Hugh with the directness of someone who had earned the right to be direct. "They are rarer than you would think." "I know," Maggie said. "I know exactly what he is." They did not hold the wedding at a church, because there was no church in Cimarron that was convenient to the valley, but at the Vega brothers' homestead, which had a wide flat area in front of it that could accommodate the gathering, and Pete Vega's wife Maria, who had come from Santa Fe in the summer, made food that was extraordinary and plentiful, and the October afternoon was clear and cold, and the mountains were the deep blue of late autumn. And Maggie Monroe became Maggie Blackwell in the clear October air, with the mountains watching, and the people who had stood with her through the difficult year standing around her. Hugh took her hand during the vows with the same careful, deliberate gentleness he had shown since February, and when the minister asked if he took this woman, he looked at her and said, "I do," with the full weight of a man who means exactly what he says and no more and no less. She said "I do" back with equal directness, and Rosalind Henley made a sound of quiet satisfaction from somewhere in the gathering, and Pete Vega's wife Maria clapped, and Abelard Vega smiled into his hat brim. They went home to Hugh's house that night, which was now their house, because the decision had been made after some practical discussion that his house was on better grazing land for the cattle and her homestead land would be better suited to the kitchen garden and the small orchard she intended to plant, and they would run both parcels together as a single operation, which meant they now had a combined 260 acres and 163 head of cattle and 2 houses and several horses and the best surveying equipment in the county. The roof did not leak. He had repaired it in spring as promised. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that makes or breaks a partnership, because marriage between 2 strong-willed and capable people requires the negotiation of shared space and shared decisions in ways that early courtship does not, and Maggie had wondered occasionally during the summer whether the daily reality of living with Hugh Blackwell would match the idealized image she had formed of him during their year of neighboring and careful courtship. It did. It did not match it exactly, because no real person matches an idealized image exactly, and there were small frictions and adjustments and 1 or 2 evenings when they went to bed on the far sides of their respective silences and worked things out in the clear-headed morning. But the foundation was right, and foundations are what matter when the winter comes. Hugh was a man who shared space well. He was not tidy in the particular way of a man who has lived alone for years and developed eccentric habits, but he was not difficult about it when she had preferences about the arrangement of the kitchen. He consulted her genuinely on decisions about the cattle and the land, not in a performative way, but in the actual way of a man who understood that his wife's judgment was worth having. When she wanted to take on a winter project, which was corresponding with the county surveyor about establishing a more systematic approach to the recording of boundary disputes, he supported it without qualification and proofread her letters when she asked him to. She discovered in that first winter that he sang to himself when he was doing outdoor work alone. Not loudly, not particularly well, just quietly under his breath, old songs from Arkansas that she did not know. And when she mentioned that she had heard him one morning from the window, he looked briefly self-conscious in a way that was so rare for him that she found it unexpectedly endearing. She told him she liked it and she meant it, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then the self-consciousness faded and he went back to the work he was doing. And the next morning she heard him again, a little less quietly. Spring came, and with the spring came a letter from the county surveyor asking if Miss Monroe, or rather, he corrected himself in a postscript that was charming in its awkwardness, Mrs. Blackwell, might be available to assist with a disputed boundary case in the northern part of the county, as the other parties had specifically requested her by name following the reputation she had acquired through the Ashford dispute. She showed the letter to Hugh at breakfast. He read it and looked up and said, "Will you go?" "Do you think I should?" she asked, not because she needed his permission but because she valued his thinking. "I think you are the best land surveyor in Colfax County and possibly in the territory," he said. "I think people with land disputes deserve someone who actually knows what they are doing, and I think if you want to do this work, you should do this work." She took the commission. Then she took another, and another, and by the summer of 1879 she had a small but growing practice as an independent survey consultant, paid in cash and occasionally in trade, and the reputation she had built through the Ashford dispute had spread in the quiet way that genuine competence spreads in small communities, which is to say thoroughly and without needing advertisement. She was also, by June, pregnant with their first child. She discovered this in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who knows her own body and had been paying attention, and she told Hugh on a June evening while they were sitting on the step of the house where she had told him about Ashford's final offer, the step that had come to mean something specific to both of them, and she said it plainly and waited for his face. His face did the thing it did when she showed him her field notes for the first time, when the shock opened into something so warm and unguarded that it left nothing at all hidden. He looked at her, and then he looked at the mountains, and then he looked at his hands, and then he looked at her again, and what was in his eyes was the full, unashamed tenderness of a man who is feeling more than he has words for. "Are you well?" he asked, because the first thing he always asked was about her, not about the abstract concept of the child or his own feelings about it. "I am very well," she said. "I expect I will continue to be very well. I am going to keep working through the summer. I am not an invalid." "I did not think you were," he said, and he reached over and put his arm around her on the step, and she leaned into him, and the June evening was warm and long-lighted, and the creek could be heard from where they sat. "I'm a little frightened," she admitted. "I know," he said. "So am I. We will be frightened together." Their son was born in January of 1880, and they named him Samuel after Maggie's father, whose full name had been Samuel Monroe, and who she thought would have liked Hugh Blackwell enormously. Samuel came into the world on a cold January night with the kind of determined energy that suggested he had opinions about the timing and intended to be present on his own schedule. And Hugh sat with Maggie through all of it and was not required to be asked twice to do anything, which she noted with exhausted appreciation in the aftermath. Samuel was a solid, serious baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's tendency to observe everything in his immediate vicinity with focused attention before committing to a response. He was not a dramatic infant, He was thorough. This pleased Maggie in a way that Hugh found very funny when she explained it. "He surveys the situation before acting," she said seriously, watching the baby examine a wooden spoon with intense concentration. "He does," Hugh said, with the laugh she treasured, warm and unreserved in the firelit kitchen. The years that followed built upon each other the way good things build, not all at once but steadily, each season adding something to what had come before. The cattle herd grew to 215 head by 1882. The kitchen garden Maggie planted on the creekside land produced prodigiously, once she understood what the soil needed, and she approached it with the same systematic attention she brought to surveying, testing and adjusting, and documenting the results. The orchard she had intended from the beginning went in the spring of 1880, and by 1883 was producing good fruit. The surveying practice grew as well, and Maggie formalized it in 1881 by purchasing a proper set of instruments to replace the ones that were wearing with use, and by establishing a regular working relationship with the county land office in which she was recognized, informally but consistently, as the most reliable independent surveyor operating in the northern part of the territory. She surveyed boundary disputes, homestead claims, water rights conflicts, and the occasional mining claim staked by men who had heard there was silver in the mountains. She was paid fairly, and the money went into the household account alongside the cattle income, and the combination meant that by 1882 they had done something remarkable, which was to pay off the note on the additional land they had acquired when an adjacent quarter section came available in 1880. They now owned 420 acres and a working operation that required real management. They hired a hand, a young man named Thomas Rays, who was 20 years old and had come up from the southern part of the territory, and who was as hardworking as any person Maggie had ever seen, and who in 3 years became essentially indispensable to the running of the Blackwell operation. Their second child, a girl they named Clara, arrived in the spring of 1883, and the name was both a coincidence of sound and a genuine choice, because Maggie had found among her grandmother's papers a gray-tant named Clara who had been described as sharp-minded and determined, and the name seemed right. Clara arrived with considerably more drama than Samuel had, and with a voice that made her opinions immediately and clearly known, and she was nothing whatsoever like the careful, deliberate boy who was 3 years old when she arrived and regarded her with the expression of a person who is reserving judgment until more data is available. Samuel and Clara were, from the beginning, exactly as different as two children from the same parents can be. Samuel, by the time he was 4, was following his mother around during her outdoor work with the focus of a very small apprentice, watching how she set the transit and wanting to know why the numbers in the notebook mattered. Clara, by the time she could walk, was attempting to climb everything that could be climbed and reasoning about the situation only after the climbing was already underway. Hugh managed both of them with a patience and warmth that Maggie had somehow known would be there, but was still moved by every time she witnessed it. He was a good father in the specific way that matters most, which is that he was present and consistent, and when he made a promise he kept it, and when one of the children was troubled, he sat with the trouble instead of moving away from it. He was 38 by 1885, and the weather had been working on him for 38 years, and the work had been working on him, and the history of his life had been working on him. And the result was a man who looked exactly like what he was, which was someone who had built something real from honest materials and intended to go on building it. Maggie was 31, and the territory had put some weather in her as well, in the lines that appeared at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting through the transit in the bright mountain light, and in the particular assurance she carried that comes from having been tested by genuine difficulty and having held. They were still, in 1885, recognizably the same people who had sat on her house step in February of 1878, which is not a small thing to say about two people 7 years on. The foundation had not shifted. The warmth was still there, the same warmth but grown larger and more comfortable with use, the way certain kinds of things improve through repetition. On a September evening in 1885, sitting on the step of their house, which was now the house they thought of as theirs in the deep sense, with the creek running in the warm evening and the orchard visible in the long light, Samuel doing something in the yard involving a stick and a complicated system of his own devising, Clara asleep inside after the dramatic conclusion of a battle with her dinner, Maggie said, "I have been thinking about something." Hugh looked at her with his steady eyes. "Tell me." "I want to train other surveyors," she said. "There are young people in this county who have the mathematics and the attention for it, but no one to teach them. If I took on apprentices, we could build something here that outlasts our own practice, a proper survey operation, not just a single woman with her father's instruments, but something established." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. She waited because she had learned that his silences were almost always productive and that the thought at the end of them was worth waiting for. "Who would you start with?" he asked. "Thomas," she said. "He has been watching me work for 3 years. He understands the principles already. He just needs formal instruction and his own instruments." "Thomas," Hugh said and nodded. "He would be good at it, and after Thomas, I will see who comes." "You will have to charge for the instruction," he said, "to make it sustainable." "I know. I have thought about the numbers." She had, of course. She showed him the notebook page where she had worked it out, and he looked at it with the attention he always gave her numbers, genuine and focused, and he nodded. "This is a good idea," he said. "I know," she said, and he smiled, and she smiled. And the September evening went on doing what September evenings do in that valley, which is to hold the warmth of summer and the clarity of approaching autumn in a combination that is very nearly perfect. She trained Thomas Rays through the winter of 1885 and into 1886, and he was every bit as capable as she had expected. And by the spring of 1886, he was conducting independent surveys under her supervision, and the quality of his work was good enough that she trusted him with straightforward boundary cases on his own. He had a natural gift for it, a spatial intelligence that matched her own in type if not yet in experience, and she told him so directly, which caused him to look at her with something between astonishment and fierce pleasure that she recognized from a long time ago. 2 more apprentices came in 1887, young men from farming families who had the mathematical background and needed work, and by 1888 Maggie Monroe Blackwell had established what amounted to a small surveying firm operating out of Cimarron, with a reputation that extended now well beyond Colfax County and into Taos and Mora counties as well. She was also pregnant again in 1888 with their 3rd child, and she continued working through most of the pregnancy with the matter-of-fact practicality that characterized her approach to her own health, taking the physically demanding field work off her schedule in the later months, but continuing the office work and the teaching and the document review without pause. Their 3rd child was another son, born in late 1888, and they named him James after Hugh's father, who had died when Hugh was young and who Hugh still thought about occasionally in the way of people whose absence was a shape rather than an event. James arrived calmly, in the manner of someone who had assessed the situation beforehand and determined the most efficient approach, which made Maggie think he might have surveying in him, but which Hugh said sounded more like good tactical sense, and they debated this pleasantly while James slept between them, pink and new and entirely himself. The family, complete at 3 children, settled into the shape of itself as families do, with its rhythms and its running arguments and its particular jokes that required no explanation and its specific points of comfort and belonging that accumulated over years, until the house and the land and the people in them were all of a piece, inseparable in the way that only time and genuine love can make things inseparable. Samuel, growing up serious and observant, began helping with actual survey work at age 12, doing exactly what Maggie had done with her father, sitting beside her at the drafting table and learning the language of contour lines and elevation markers. He was good at it, which did not surprise either of his parents. Clara, fierce and determined and not remotely interested in surveying, developed a talent for the practical management of the cattle operation that impressed even Hugh, who had been at it for 20 years. By the time she was 10, she understood the economics of a cattle operation with the instinctive clarity of someone for whom numbers and outcomes came naturally, and she could tell you at any given moment approximately what each animal in the herd was worth, and what the conditions of the market were likely to mean for the following season. She had learned some of this from Hugh and some of it from simply paying attention, and the combination of sources was evident in the particular quality of her analysis, which was both instinctive and informed. James, the youngest, turned out to be the musician, which nobody had predicted. He had a natural ear for it, and he had acquired, through a complicated series of trades and negotiations that took 2 years and involved a goat and a cart wheel and several bushels of apples, a battered but functional harmonica by the time he was 8, and by 10 he could play anything he heard. Hugh recognized in James the same unspecific wildness he had recognized in himself at that age, the quality of reaching for something without knowing quite what it was, and he sat with James in that quality the way his own father never had had the chance to do, and James grew up feeling met in that particular room of himself, which made all the difference. In 1893, 15 years after Maggie Monroe had arrived in the territory with $63 and her father's instruments and a plan, she was invited by the New Mexico Land Office to present a workshop to a gathering of county surveyors and land office officials in Santa Fe on the subject of boundary dispute documentation and resolution. The invitation came in a formal letter on land office stationery and referred to her as one of the foremost authorities in the territory on accurate land survey methodology. She brought the letter home and put it on the kitchen table, and Hugh picked it up and read it, and when he looked up his eyes held the same warmth and the same particular quality of wonder they had held the first time he had looked at her field notes 15 years before. It had not diminished. It had, if anything, deepened with the weight of 15 years of watching what she was. "You should go," he said. "I plan to," she said. "Will you take Samuel?" She thought about this. Samuel was 15 and capable, and the train to Santa Fe was a thing he would remember. "Yes," she said, "I will take Samuel." She went to Santa Fe in October of 1893 with Samuel beside her on the train, both of them watching the territory flow past the window with the attentive eyes of people who know how to read land. And she stood in a room full of professional surveyors and land officials, and she presented the methodology she had developed through 15 years of practice in the field, the systematic approach to documentation, the cross-referencing with original government markers, the mathematical verification protocols, all of it organized and clear and authoritative, and the room listened with the attention of people who recognized real expertise when they encountered it. Samuel sat in the back of the room and watched his mother stand in front of the assembled professionals of the territory and speak with complete authority about the work she loved, and he watched the room listen, and he felt something settle into place in himself that would stay settled for the rest of his life. She came home to Hugh and Clara and James and the valley that was fully and finally and irrevocably theirs, the creek running clear in October, the orchard done with its fruit and resting into the cool, the cattle in the pasture, the house solid and warm around them. And Hugh met her on the step when the wagon came into the yard, and he took her hands and looked at her face, and what she saw in his eyes was the same thing she had been seeing for 15 years, undiminished and deepened and entirely. Irreversibly hers. "How was it?" he asked. "It was everything I hoped," she said. He pulled her toward him and held her in the October evening with the mountains blue in the late light, and she put her face against the worn canvas of his coat, and she breathed in the smell of him, which was cedar and cold air and something indefinably and specifically Hugh. And she felt the full weight of what she had built, the land and the work and the 3 children who would grow up knowing that what you are and what you love are not things that need apologizing for. And the man who had seen her from the beginning and loved what he saw, all of it layered and solid under her feet and around her heart. She had been offered more. 2,000 acres and a house with glass windows and a barn already standing and cattle enough to fill it. She had been offered everything that could be measured in acreage and rooms and the visible tallying of material wealth. She had chosen the man who offered her less of all of that and more of everything that actually mattered. She had chosen the man who looked at her field notes and told her not to diminish what she was, who refused to speak for her when she could speak for herself, who sat with her fear on the step of her house and said, "We will be frightened together," who sang old Arkansas songs under his breath while he worked and laughed in barns and held her hands with the careful gentleness of a man who knew the value of what he was holding. She had never regretted it for a single morning of a single day of any year that had followed. "Come inside," she said to him, stepping back from his arms but keeping his hand, the same hands, big and warm and rough, that had first taken hers on a February step 15 years ago. "Clara has been managing the dinner situation, and I have some fears about the outcome." Hugh made a sound that was the beginning of the laugh she treasured, and he came with her, and the October door closed behind them on the valley and the mountains and the creek and the orchard and the cattle and the years, all of it waiting outside in the clean evening air, all of it genuinely theirs. And inside the house that had once been small and was now the right size for the life it held, the lamps were lit and Clara was arguing with the stew about something and James had his harmonica out and the notes of it were coming sweet and wandering through the warm air. And Samuel was at the table with a notebook that had the same careful handwriting as his mother's, and it was, in every way that can be counted and in all the ways that cannot, exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.